Good afternoon. I'm Chris Rakedahl, Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Washington. Thank you for being a part of what we hope to be a really fantastic and innovative series. Over the next several months, we'll have 8 or 9 releases where we'll walk the public and the media and policy leaders through significant topics that are transformational. We've all lived through a very challenging time the last couple of years, but the innovation that sits underneath all of that complexity has moved forward. So each, probably every 2 or 3 weeks, we'll have a topic that comes forward that lifts up some of the best practices that we've learned, that challenges the legislature and policymakers to take it to the next step. Our hope is that you get a sense that as we walk into the next legislative session, that our state is not only recovering from an enrollment standpoint, a learning standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, but we are looking forward to significant innovations. Today, we're going to focus on the first one, and it's really about transforming the way we use a natural resource in this state, primarily timber, but there's other resources in what we call the Common School Trust. This is the first in a series that we refer to as Washington State Innovates, K-12 education for the 21st century and beyond. Let's talk about what this topic isn't today. There are many trusts in our state. We have an incredible Department of Natural Resources led by Commissioner Hillary Franz and a very hardworking staff. For a lot of historic reasons, they are the managers of public lands to the benefit of certain beneficiaries. There is a large benefit to a group called State Forest Trust Lands. Those are our counties, hospital districts, other things. We are not talking about that today. So for those of you watching to see if something's happening different with county revenues or library districts or something, that is not the topic. Today, we're talking about the part of their management task at DNR that is to manage a trust for common schools. This money is generated through the harvest of timber primarily, but there are other sources in that trust. There's agricultural lands, there's leases. We grow grapes, we have other commercial leases, but about 50 to 60% of the revenue generated is from trees. That money goes to our legislature, and then they make decisions on how to send those dollars through appropriation to our school system. Our legislature has chosen to put it in what we call the School Construction Assistance Program. It's a capital budget program that when local school districts pass a bond, generally, or some other capital action of the voters, then our state provides a match to them. And that money comes from these Common School Trust dollars. The challenge in our state is you have to have a 60% vote to pass a local bond. So today we're going to talk about some of the challenges of that and how the money from this trust is disproportionately going to urban communities, even though the revenue and the timber is generated in rural communities. There's an incredible solution here that we think is bipartisan and bicameral. Urban, suburban, and rural can come together on, and we're excited to talk about that. So we should start with a little bit of the data. You've got a sense here of the first of 4 graphics we want to show you. The blue line you're seeing at the top takes all of that trust revenue from the Common School Construction account. It looks 10 years back, and it says of all the money that the state legislature matches for local school district buildings, how much of that comes from our trust revenue? It was nearly 30% a decade ago, and you see now it's down to 10%. So the legislature's contribution, if you will, to local school district construction in our state is only about 10 or 15%. And of the amount that the state provides, we're now down to about 10% of it coming from trust revenue. We gave you a second line down here in yellow that I hope you can see that tries to take that trust revenue and divide it by all of our school construction dollars on an annual basis. So we take all those local dollars that voters have approved, we add the fraction of the money that the state is providing, we then take that and we examine what the trust benefits are doing. And as you can see here, it's gone from 3.4% to roughly 1.3, 1.4% that same decade. When we pull out just the timber revenue, so we're talking about the harvest of timber to support school construction, it's the last line you see at the bottom there. It's tough to notice it because it was at 2% a decade ago and it's down to 0.7% today. We need folks in the state of Washington to understand that this incredible natural resource that we have in Washington, trees, is a valuable source of carbon storage. It helps industry, It builds facilities, not just in this state, but for our national market. Our state policy is to keep those resources domestic, so these trees and these dollars do not go outside of our borders of the United States. But it is a declining share of what we do. Instead, our legislature has asked our voters to be the biggest contributor to their own school construction. So unlike our operating budget, which we've spent the last 5 years talking about, where the court has intervened and essentially required the legislature to pick up 75% of the cost of operating schools, capital budgets don't work that way. 80 to 90% of capital funds come from local voters. 10 to 15% come from the state. And again, of the share coming from the state, less than 10% of that now is coming from trust revenue, which means it's a very tiny fraction of the nearly $4 billion we spend a year in school facilities. All right, let's take a look at the second one here. Tough to see. We're going to send this all out to the media in a packet if you haven't gotten it already. What we do take a look at is all of this revenue generated in the first column of dollars and where the dollars are spent in the state of Washington from these trusts. So these are the cash portions, if you will. We harvest timber, we lease fields for wheat, we lease properties for grape growing, we have cell towers on some of these trust lands that generate money. When we calculate where all that's coming from, county by county, and where it is spent, you see enormous differences. We've tried to highlight for you here in yellow where the revenue is generated by county, and in blue is where it is being spent. The major challenge that we raised for the governor, the legislature, and those of you considering a policy change is that we're generating this resource in rural Washington that often takes 40, 60, 80 years for a tree to be ready for harvest. The revenue, as well as the timber, is almost exclusively landing in our most urban counties. King County, Pierce County, Spokane County, and interestingly, Yakima County is one that doesn't generate a lot of revenue, but it does have a significant amount of spending that it has benefited from over the last decade. We are a state that has to share in our interests. Our kids deserve equitable opportunities to learn no matter where they are. It should not be the case that because you can pass a bond in a wealthier part of our state, that you're the one getting all those matching dollars versus a community that might be very property poor, even if they can pass a bond at 60%, that the amount that they get matched is not significant enough to really transform their schools. We have to change that narrative. And that's part of what we want to share with you today, is there's a way to do it that is significantly more equitable. Here's the basic summary of what we're proposing and will be a part of our capital budget request to the legislature over the next 3 or 4 months to we finalize. We are asking to remove all of the common school trust revenue from the school construction assistance program. Take it out completely, backfill the school construction program with general obligation bonds or other sources. That's where most of the money comes from anyways. So then our school matching program, which our urban counties are disproportionately benefiting from, is being matched by general revenue in which they are participating in through sales tax, B&O tax, property taxes, and other resources. Take those trust dollars, which are about $50 or $60 million per year now, and dedicate those exclusively to common school trust activities in rural communities. So not the matching program, but specifically targeted programs, often grant programs in rural communities. Small district modernization, including seismic retrofits. We have schools that are in tsunami zones. They have to literally be moved or have to be lifted. They're in floodplains, but there's no scenario where they have the property tax base to do that significant work without at least getting back the revenue that's being generated in their community. And that undoubtedly will need additional support from the legislature. We want to expedite efforts to ensure clean water in our schools and our rural communities. Our legislature has done an amazing job investing in the removal of lead in our water. It's mostly the fixtures, sometimes it's in the pipes. We can speed that up in rural communities, which often have some of our oldest schools in them. We want energy efficiency grants to flow to rural schools at an expedited rate. These are often property poor communities, which means they don't have a lot of discretion in levy dollars. So anything we can do to keep those timber dollars in their communities, transforming their energy consumption, it's lighting changes, it's all kinds of energy efficiency changes. This saves rural communities dollars and obviously puts less pressure on energy production and lowers our carbon footprint for the entire state. Career and technical education program grants. These are often high cost, expensive equipment elements or labs that have to be built out. And in modern schools, when we build them new, these facilities are amazing, but in older schools, particularly older rural schools, these things can lag behind so many decades that students don't get a real-time experience for their learning. The additional opportunity here is to invest more in the forests themselves. These are trusts to the benefits of the people of the state of Washington. And if we want those forests in 20 years and 50 years and 100 years to withstand the complicated and inevitable pressure of climate change that is upon us today, it is worth putting some of these trust dollars back in as an investment into the healthy forest. Silviculture, more planting of trees, taking care of riparian areas, focusing on clean water, managing and thinning forests to reduce the risk of fire and responding to fire more appropriately. Nobody benefits, whether you're in Seattle or Spokane or Wahkiakum County or Grays Harbor, if our forests are on fire, and that is a continuing risk even in Western Washington in the coming years and coming decades. And finally, of course, we want planning grants to move forward as part of this, because as we think about what trust beneficiary means, it will be so different in 100 years compared to what it is today. And trust beneficiaries, in our case, schools, they should be the benefactors of incredible wind generation for energy, solar, and other projects that put those trust lands in a position to have the biggest yield going forward. Let me conclude. We spend a lot of energy in this state pulling resources out of rural Washington and subsidizing urban schools. We want all schools to have an equitable opportunity at construction, modernization, revamping, health, and safety. We're asking the legislature to fully fund their matching program with general bonds. We're asking that those rural dollars generated from the trust stay in rural communities to focus on these priorities. All of us have a shared interest in this. We think it's an exciting opportunity to bring people together. And I will also add this. We typically are looking at 500 million or more in total state resources that the state matches our school districts, who are putting forward about $3.5 billion a year. Because the last year or two has been so complicated, we have fewer districts and communities that have passed that bond at 60%. So our legislature is getting about a $200 million benefit by having fewer of these matching projects. So we know there's capacity to make this transition now. Let's do it now at a time when the demand for state capital dollars is at the lowest point it has been in the last 7 or 8 years. Let's make that transition so that every school and every student has an incredible opportunity to learn in contemporary spaces. This is what shared interest in Washington State looks like. King County looking after Wahkiakum County, Grays Harbor making sure that Pierce County has what it needs. Now is the time to make the change. This has not happened in this sort of transformational way in over 80 years. Let's make sure we get some questions answered from folks on this or beyond. Let's get into it, Katie.
First, we have Venice from Crosscut.
Sorry, I can't. Oh, hello. Sorry, I just unmuted. Yeah, I was wondering whether this would be, thanks for taking my question. I was wondering whether this would be dependent on like passage of bonds in local communities, or is this going to be just like a grant type of application that they seek?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Our interest in this, because these dollars are generated locally, is that the dollars stay in those communities and be a direct cash source for them. There is still the matching program that these same rural communities would be eligible for. That does require that they bring capital dollars locally. Generally, it's that 60% bond vote. It could be a capital levy. So we'll let that program continue to stand as something where the state or the locals have to bring forward some dollars. But we think trust dollars in the future should be left in those communities as a direct source and not necessarily contingent upon them having some kind of match. These are their high-rise buildings, as I always say. If you're in Bellevue or Seattle or Spokane or Vancouver and there's a big new construction and development, your economic activity grows. In rural Washington, it's a Doug fir. It's a cedar. it's a hemlock. And when it grows, that money should stay locally. So we would not be looking for a local match on these, but direct grant dollars.
Our next question is from Dee Dee Sun with Kairos 7.
Hi, Superintendent Ragdoll. Thanks so much for talking with us and taking a couple of questions. I actually was hoping to talk with you real quick about big picture. You know, there are a series of 9 different events that you'll be hosting. Is there anything that you feel, you know, as the press release indicated, you know, the office is working on some transformative changes for the school year. Is there anything else that you feel that you're really looking forward to discussing, or that you feel will really make a big impact on how schools are working here in Washington?
Yeah, every topic we're going to bring you, we think, is impactful and it has longevity. Think about this one. It's $60 million a year, but over 10 years, this is a $600 million investment in rural communities, $1.2 billion over 20 years. So we're going to bring dual credit. We're going to bring early learning. We're going to make sure you have a really powerful orientation to an idea we have to make sure that all kids go to school and have access to meals, not just some kids who qualify. We are talking about significant transformation of our schools that puts our students at the center of our decisions, not institutions, not East and West, not urban and rural, but what are those equitable opportunities that lift up all of our students with significant transformation in the way policymakers think about it. So there's just a little bit of a tease for 3 or 4 of the topics. I think you'll find all of them to be significant and transformative and doable.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Next question is coming from Drew Mickelson at KeyCut.
Good afternoon, Superintendent. I know you've supported efforts in the past to lower that threshold for the bonds. They've really not progressed very far at the legislature. What makes you think that can happen? Why hasn't that move worked in the past?
Yeah, thank you, Drew. Definitely 2 separate issues. We're not suggesting this is contingent at all on that movement from 60% to 50. This program can move forward even if that threshold stays at 60%. But to your point, I will say to all rural legislators, to all rural communities watching this, the greatest investment you can make in your children is to pass those local bonds when they come before you. It isn't just that you are contributing to your own long-term success of your kids. This matching program we talked about on the front end, it comes with dollars that are often 8-to-1, 9-to-1. We have districts that will qualify for 15-to-1 matches, almost 20-to-1 matches. So I do hope the legislature takes up this question again of 60%. Sticking with 60 is the most harmful thing we can do for rural communities. I'm trying to address that in part by leaving the timber revenue and the trust revenue in their communities as grants, but that will not even touch the need out there. So I appreciate you bringing it up. It is a separate issue for our reasons here, but it could also be a powerful factor for rural communities. If they would help get that threshold from 60 to 50, then when they pass those, they would be eligible for significant matches. Who wouldn't want to put in $1 and within a couple of years get $8 or $9 or $10 back? It certainly beats today's equity markets. So I hope everyone will think about that.
Thank you, Drew. Next up, we have Jeanne Lindsey from the Seattle Times.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question. I'm curious, you talked a little bit about it there at the end before questions, but I'm wondering if you can expand on why now is a good time to change the way this works, especially as schools are grappling with pandemic fallout and that expiring funding in the next couple of years, and maybe what other aspects need to change to enhance equity across schools.
Great. I think now is the moment, and the reason we're sort of picking this with the pace we are is, again, as I said, our state has been working a formula for many, many years that indexes people's property values in a community to determine how much they get in match. The lower your property value against the state average for your community, the more match you get. But again, we have communities that aren't participating at all in that and can't, nor are they getting the benefit of this trust revenue that's been coming to the state. So now is the right policy time. And as I said, we've been passing fewer of these in the last year. So for a while, our legislature has remarkable capacity in the capital budget, not more particularly, but if they stay focused on the $500 million to $1 billion that they've been giving us per biennium, but backfilling these timber dollars, these trust dollars, if they'll put general obligation funds into that matching program, we can target these dollars in rural communities, and the legislature hasn't particularly had to spend a whole lot more money. And in fact, for a year or two, it might be less than what they've been contributing. So there's just this unique moment in time where this transition is not going to impact other parts of the capital budget. Thereafter, of course, we hope that they will continue to invest more and more. Equitable opportunity for us is, does that same student in Pacific County walk into the same amazing lab as that student in Snohomish County? And pick any two places you want. That's how we're thinking about this. So amazing opportunity now, just given what's happened in our economy in the last 2 years and what's happened in terms of local voters.
Thank you, Jeannie. We now have a follow-up question from Dee with Kairos.
Thanks for taking the time to handle a follow-up question. So, again, I'm still looking to talk big picture today. So, as people are just starting to gear up to go back to school, several school districts are dealing with that pandemic fallout that you mentioned, and some districts are worried about declining enrollment. There was also a recent Gallup poll that showed American trust in public schools overall are declining. Is OSPI doing anything specific to address these two issues?
Yeah, I'll first say that that same poll showed public trust in all institutions declining in America. So we won't highlight schools in particularly, but we're sensitive to that. And part of, I think, what you're seeing us say is we have this moment right now to help folks understand that while we've all been kind of looking backwards for the last 2 years, how do we get back to where we were and how do we recover where we were? Part of the challenge is not going back to where we were from a policy and equity standpoint, but how do we move forward? So you saw our legislature in a bipartisan way work incredibly hard, even through this pandemic, to not just put one-time money into our schools because of enrollment impacts, but they put permanent counselor money, nurses, school psychologists, parent outreach. They've enhanced compensation to stabilize folks. They've made more investments in support for students with disabilities. We are blessed to be in the state of Washington with a legislature that focuses on this. Our job is to say to them that a little bit more money in one time isn't going to get it done. Those dollars will come and go. And you can't hire counselors and nurses and school psychologists and teachers and paraeducators and bus drivers on temporary money. People don't want to work for 6 months and have the risk it goes away. So we're saying, let's move past the one-time money and let's talk about those significant investments long-term in our schools. And some of it sits right in front of us here in capital dollars. And in our next 7 or 8 things we roll out, those will all be on the operating side of the budget. But again, they'll be transformational. It's permanent investment. It's things that look forward. They don't look backwards. I will also add, about enrollments, they're already recovering, which is exciting. They are entitlements. So as enrollments come back, those dollars come back to school districts. So if we enhance that experience for kids and we put those key investments into our students and our staff, as enrollments come back, they'll come back at a higher rate. It's important. It's a worry right now for districts. It's very real, and they're struggling to kind of manage through that. The feds have provided us $3 billion in one-time money. The state has put some one-time money into it. We're saying it's time to make permanent investments long-term. So as enrollments recover, it's also coming with the kind of supports that we can sustain for a very, very long time.
Thanks, Judy. We also have a follow-up from Drew Nicholson.
As a former legislator, how hard it is to move money around in a budget, especially something that's been done one way for so long, 100+ years. Is this realistic to say that the legislature next year, who knows who's in charge and all that, but that there will be an interest in your plan?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. We've reached out to capital budget members, the chairs. We've tried to be as public as we can. We've met with stakeholders on the timber side, the Department of Natural Resources, the environmental community, the trust beneficiaries. We've been building this conversation for a while, and if anyone's tuned into Department of Natural Resource conversations, I, along with 5 others, serve on the board of Natural Resources, me by virtue of a statute that requires that in my role as state superintendent. I've been elevating this issue for a while. What we're doing now is putting pen to paper. It is absolutely doable. Our legislature already invests in rural grant programs. They're already investing in seismic work and tsunami work. What isn't rational today is that most of our tax generation in the Puget Sound funds those programs, And most of the timber revenue generated in rural Washington goes to urban counties. So there's no logic, because we haven't refreshed the concept of where those dollars are, how to keep local communities more viable with the assets that they have. And so that's what this really attempts to do. It's very doable, to the point where we're asking them to do this and continue to invest more in how much they put in terms of square footage per student, how much amount per square foot they spend. There are huge opportunities here for our legislature to kind of think about it the way they do operating. Again, in this state, K-12 is about half the state budget. 75% of the operating budgets in our schools comes from the state, but when it comes to capital, the K-12 system is only about 25% of the capital budget, and the state's only putting in about 10 or 15% of the money it takes to build schools, renovate schools, replace schools, and make them safe. We're asking them to start reconsidering that. They can do it. Every House member is running right now. Half of our state Senate is running for re-election. This is the year they should be in every single door, in every single neighborhood, in every single forum, talking about excellent schools going forward.
Thanks, Drew. We have another follow-up from Venice Buchanan from Prospect.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for taking follow-up questions. You addressed this a little bit earlier about why now and what the timing, and why it's advantageous to think about changing the system now. But I was also wondering, has there been any change in the success of construction bonds in school districts, in the past year or two? I'm wondering if that's anything that you've been seeing at OSPI.
Great. As we kind of look back 10 years, our construction passage rate at the local level, even at the 60%, has been steadily growing until this last year. We definitely saw a dip, but it wasn't really that a lot of them failed in higher volumes. It's that a lot of districts didn't bring them to the voters. There was so much nervousness about school, the complexity of face covering, the national culture war that sort of landed here around vaccines. So a lot of districts just didn't take the vote to their voters. So we definitely saw a lower number of capital bond issues before the voters, and then a smaller passage rate. That's partly what's creating capacity here. Our legislature has a model where they expected to invest a lot more in our schools. They're getting a little break here, and we're saying, hey, go backfill that construction assistance program, pull the trust money out, put that in rural communities. Everybody gets better here. And for a while, this doesn't cost the legislature anything more. As far as our levies go, I do want to say that those are different. Those are at 50%. Those are for operating activities. We saw our levy rate across the state hold up beautifully. Very, very consistent percentage of the number of levies passing. The average vote, yes, was a little bit down, but the total passage rate was really, really solid. In many regions exceeded where we were prior to the pandemic. So we're already seeing that recovery enrollments. We're seeing voters understand how important their local schools are. They're supporting them. It's now time to transform the state budget, though, so that rural dollars stay in rural communities and everyone gets a healthy match when they pass one of those things.
Thank you, Venice. We have another follow-up question from Jeanne Lindsey with Seattle Times.
Hello again. Sorry, this is a little outside of the education realm, but I'm curious, since you talked about it with using some of these dollars to help maintain healthy forests, as the vision here to reduce the amount of logging happening on public lands. I'm curious with the idea of using fewer dollars from this for, specifically in education, targeting those for forests instead. If you can just connect some of, I guess, the environmental dots for me.
Yeah, the vast bulk of our proposal, all of it stays with the benefit of the trust. So we don't make any changes to that. There are constitutional amendments likely required if you did that. We don't make any recommendations around that. All of these dollars will stay to the benefit of the trust. We clearly want rural districts to be the benefactors of this, who have struggled to get the dollars they need. And part of what we're suggesting here is we're going to dip our toes into this idea that it isn't just about today. It isn't harvest something today and have cash available tomorrow for a school district 100 or 200 miles away. It's keeping the dollars local, and we should start taking some risk to invest trust dollars into the health and management of our forests, even more than we do today, because that's a long-term investment. Any company today has so much they return to their employees, they return to shareholders, but then there's always a budget for how much they're reinvesting their capital back into the system. And I'm challenging us to think about that. And I'll leave that to the legislature. I don't know if that's 5 of the 50 million annually, 10 of the 50 million annually, but anything we can do to keep these forests viable, that's trust beneficiary dollars that are coming in the future. If we don't do that well, if the Department of Natural Resources doesn't have the ability to thin and manage forests to prevent fire, if they can't respond to risk of disease, if they can't take care of riparian areas, we don't get as much clean water. If they can't do what they have to do to manage forests, including silviculture, planting trees for future generations, if they don't have those resources, today doesn't matter a whole lot. We find ourselves 20 or 50 years down the road with burnt forests, with lack of acreage available for harvest. The companies lose out on that. The school districts lose out on that. We all lose out on that. So I am dipping my toe in the water here to say not just immediate cash benefits as grants to rural communities, but let's also spend some of this money to think about how to make those trust lands productive in the future, not just for harvest, which we need to do. It is a part of who we are. People want to live in houses. We build houses with wood. It's a renewable resource that's important, but so is wind. So is solar, so are commercial leases, so is agriculture. We can diversify that portfolio with some investments today that I think makes a lot of sense for the long term.
I think that's it for the questions today. So if you want to wrap this up.
Great. Thank you again for being a part of this. Again, this is the first in a series where we're going to talk about significant innovations. It challenges all of us to think differently. If all we do is what we've always done, we will always get what we've always got. And right now, those are pretty darn good schools. But I want to be the best. I want people around the country to not just talk about Massachusetts when they think about school funding or outcomes for students or opportunities for young people. I want them to think about the state of Washington. But we know that this state for 100 years has been harvesting timber, growing grapes, growing wheat in rural communities, and disproportionately putting that in a bucket of money that is the benefit of mostly people who live in urban and suburban areas. We want those communities to have their matching dollars. So I'm challenging the legislature to put those dollars in full play for those communities and leave those rural dollars with rural communities so that they can make progress. We can do all of this today for the resources we have and think about more investment down the road. And we can also do this today and start to think about how those trusts get significant resources in the future, not just from natural resources, but generating energy and engaging activities that are more climate friendly and that we will desperately need. We already need it, but we'll need it even more in the future. Our public lands are a gift. They are precious. They are for the trust of the public. They are for our school students in this case. And as we think about them, not just tomorrow, not just the next building, not just the next budget cycle, the next election, think about them for 50 or 100 years. You would do things different today, knowing what we know today around the inequity of the dollars and the climate change that we face. This is our moment, and this is just one of 9 things in transformation we'll bring you. Thanks for being a part of it. Our team's available for follow-up. If you need any of this data beyond the slides, we're happy to send it to you. Thanks again to all of the stakeholders that we worked with. This is just the start. Thank you to legislators who have met with us. We look forward to working with you further. Let's get this done and let's do something we haven't done in over 80 years in the state of Washington. Thank you.